without too much further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Laura Jiménez. She is the Department Chair for Language and Literacy Education at Boston University. She studies literature and literacy through a social justice lens and can be found on her blog, booktoss.org, and on Twitter at booktoss. I highly recommend that you follow her there. This is about the fourth or fifth workshop that we've done with Dr. Jiménez, and they have all been wonderful, and we look forward to continuing to hear your wisdom. We're turning it over to you.
I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you my dog, because he's not a COVID dog. It's just that he now thinks this is his office chair. I used to use that chair to read in, and now I don't because it's no longer my chair. I think we all have that experience where we have the last 18 months to 2 years have really changed what our normal is. And so, yeah, as Christopher said, I used to come up to Vermont like twice a year and talk to y'all in person. And now I do it over Zoom. And I'll tell you, I mean, I really think the accessibility functions and the general accessibility of Zoom is great. And in some ways, I don't want to lose that. Especially for states like Vermont, where y'all are, far flung and few between, and it makes it so much easier for you to just click on or click in later with a link. On the other hand, I do find myself missing human interactions. As Christopher said, I teach at Boston University. We are back in person. Which just seems bizarre to me, but that's what we're doing, and it's going really well. I don't know how you all are doing. I think the mental health struggles in the last couple months are absolutely real, and I hope you all are taking care of yourselves as we move forward. My specialty, my research, my scholarship is centralized on the representation of marginalized individuals, communities, and histories in children's and YA literature. So, I mean, basically all I'm ever doing is reading. I'm reading books. I'm constantly reading. I have a couple of new books that I just finished reading. Flamer, this is really good. It's by Mike Curato. It's about a young man coming out, and he's doing it at a Boy Scout camp, right? Let's see, what else have I been reading lately? I'm teaching America Chavez in my children's lit course, because I teach in a college of education, so I teach teachers how to use novels and picture books and graphic novels in different ways in the classroom. And one of the main things that I try to get folks to think about and think deeply about is the systems that we're in the effect of those systems, how to disrupt those systems, and finally, how to get, and these are not like 1, 2, 3 order. These are just sort of like, think of them as bullet points, right? And also how to get kids really engaged and involved in interpretation of literature, not just a check-in and a check-out, but really into deep discussion, engagement, and interpretation. So I've got some stuff to sort of set the stage. So Ryan, I'm going to flip over and I'm going to try to share my screen like we did before. All right, so the book that we're going to be talking about is We Contain Multitudes, but a lot of what I'm talking about is part of any discussion, any book event you're going to have with that deals with marginalized voices and stories. Okay, so hold on, there we go. So again, so you know my name, you know where I work. Let's see. Oh, I'm a white presenting Latina lesbian. So that means I walk into a room and I am full on whiteness all the time. Like people look at me when I had darker hair. I have very, very gray hair now. When I had darker hair, people would look at me and they would sort of get a feeling of vague ethnicity, non-whiteness, but they really didn't have much of a clue. But my dad is Mexican and my mom is white. She's from Minnesota, and so, you know, almost as white as Vermont. Right. Let's see, I'm an out lesbian, right? And I think that's very important to state. Like Christopher, you might not be able to tell, but let's admit it. And I think it's important for me to say that at the beginning of everything so that we all know, you know, a little bit of where my bias and where my ideas and ideals are going to come from. Okay? And I'm going to talk in general about children's literature. Don't ask me anything about adult lit. I don't know. I haven't read a book written for adults in years and years and years. So it's just not my area. It's not my area. You know, no shade to you if that's what you read and that's what you enjoy. It's not where I live. And then we're going to really talk about the discussion questions. Okay. So some assumptions. I always like to start with this. Okay. Racism. All right. And all other forms of oppression are bad for everybody. There's nobody that it's good for. Right. Unchallenged and unearned privileges are problematic. They're problematic, right? And unearned privileges means you're born to it. You are white, cis, male, right? Those are unearned privileges. You haven't done anything for that. Now, I have an earned privilege. I have a PhD. I'm like the most educated person in the room most of the time, right? And so that's an earned privilege. It gives me an enormous amount of privilege in the world. A lot of times economic privilege can be earned or unearned, you know, depending on the circumstances. We all have to live with the fact that our intentions are not our actions, right? We all have intergroup bias. We always think that us, however we think of us, we are always so much better than whoever we think of as them, right? And unfortunately, we're all racist, sexist, ableist, and homophobic. Right? Because we're a product of a racist, sexist, and homophobic society. You know, just our work here is to get better and to do better. Right? I use Bell and Adams when I think about social justice, and they talk about the full and equitable participation of people from all social identity groups in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. Now, this is really important. I'm not talking about tolerance. I'm not talking about, love the sin. No, what is it? Hate the sin, love the sinner. No, none of that. I don't want to be tolerated. I don't want to be, looked down upon. I don't want to be sympathized with. No, I have needs. You have needs. We all have basic needs that must be met, right? And it doesn't matter what groups we belong to. And we all deserve to participate in this democracy and in this society. Another sort of like, I do a lot of housekeeping stuff at the beginning. A term you're going to hear me use is own voices, right? And so, Karina Dalvis, she is a YA lit author, and she just sort of threw it out on Twitter in 2015. And she said she'd like to recommend Kid Lit about diverse characters written by authors from that same diverse group. Now, we've changed that a little bit as language has progressed, as language has evolved. And so I now talk about own voices as being books by and about, right? So by and about marginalized communities, right? And so that idea of a marginalized community is really important to keep in mind. What that means is it's not, so the word she used was diverse, right? And we can talk about diverse from what, right? Saying you're diverse still centers that thing that you're really, you're not talking about, but that's what you're thinking about, right? Diverse literature is diverse from what, right? Right, talking about minorities, right? Look, folks, the census has come back, or at least bits and pieces of the census have come back. The United States is now more, by numbers, more people identify as women than men. So we are no longer the minority. Does our society really function like that? Right? Do we have that kind of representation? Do we have that kind of, representation in medicine, in law, in government? No, because women are still a marginalized. The systems are actively putting us aside, marginalizing us. I'm going to go into that a little bit. Right now, I want to talk about children's literature. I love the CCBC, and they are the children's, Children's Cooperative CCBC Book Center, Children's Cooperative Book Center. They're out of Madison, Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, Madison. And every couple of years, they look at all the picture books published in the United States. Okay, so that's a lot of picture books, right? 3,000. I think this year, I think they're going to do it this year. They might be doing it in 2022. They're estimating there's going to be 4,000 books they're going to look for. This one is about 3,000 books, okay? 3,000 picture books. And all they did was they counted up characters that could be identified. And what that means is, if it's a bunch of people playing baseball, the players on the field might be identifiable, but the folks up in the stand are just sort of a blur of people. So those didn't necessarily get counted, but the players on the field would get counted because they're identifiable. Okay, so in 2015, 73, a little bit more than 73% of the identifiable characters in picture books published in the US were white. And you'll notice on this little infographic, because I wanted you to take a look at this, right? The first picture, it's a little blue-eyed, blonde-haired boy. And he's got lots of mirrors around him because all of these reflections of himself, right? And in these little mirrors, you can see, if you look real closely, he can be a king, he can be an astronaut, he can have a dog, he can be a basketball player, right? He can be a superhero. He can be all of these things because he's got all this representation, right? And then I'm going to skip the rabbit for now. Okay, there's also this picture of a rabbit. I'm going to skip that one, right? And then scoot down, right? African-American characters, about 7.5% of the characters were African-American. Asian Pacific Islanders, right? Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And let's keep in mind, that includes Southeast Asians. So we're looking at a good quarter of the population of the world. Okay. They represent about 3% of the characters in books. And again, these are books that were published in 2015. Okay, so that's, a minute ago, right? Okay. Latinx, we got a close to 2.5%, and American Indians, Native Americans, indigenous folks, they don't even hit 9%. They don't even hit 9%. 1%. They're 0.9. So they don't even hit 1%. And if you'll notice, the reason why I really like this this infographic, this picture, is because just as the little white boy has all of these options, there are all of these mirrors that reflect who he is and who he can be and who he imagines and who we as readers can imagine him being, right? That one for the indigenous folks is a little shard of the mirror and is warped. And that indicates that the stories that we have, the narratives that we hold for especially the indigenous folks, right, are warped and they are misaligned with reality, and they don't do a good job of showing authentic stories, authentic narratives, authentic history, right? All right. So please note that all of those folks together, all those non-white characters together, don't even come to a fraction, right, of what's of white folks being reflected, and especially white boys. Then I want you to notice the standing rabbit who's standing there with his arms outstretched, and he's got a mirror and he's smiling, right? And the mirror's huge. The mirror's really big. Yeah, when they first did this study, they didn't expect to have such a huge, anthropomorphized animal or objects, but it was ginormous. 12.5% of characters in picture books in 2015 are anthropomorphized objects or animals. So we're not talking about like a wolf book where wolves are acting like wolves. We're talking about, Peter Rabbit. We're talking about, what are those ones? Like George the monkey, right? For Curious George, or right, any of a dozen, hundreds, literally hundreds of books where animals enact humanness, right? So in other words, if you add these up, you are more likely to see yourself reflected if you're a talking rabbit than you are if you're anybody who's non-white. All right. And this was a huge study, and it made a lot of ripples, and a lot of folks really said this is unacceptable. And organizations like We Need Diverse Books was born out of this, and social justice books really took a long, hard look at this. And some other organizations, and some publishers got together and said, wow, we were unaware, so we pledged to do better. So a lot of them really thought hard and, went out there and tried to do their best. And so they redid the same study in 2018. So 3 years later, same deal. This one had about 3,000, a little bit more, about 3,100 books. Okay. And you'll notice the representation of white folks dropped substantially, right? By like 20%. Okay. And the other ones rose a little bit, right? African and African Americans got up to 10%, right? Asian Pacific Islanders, they had a huge leap. They went from about a little bit more than 3% to 7%. So they like doubled, right? Latinxes, we made a little bit of a run for it. And American Indians or Native Americans or indigenous folks, they broke 1%. Woohoo! 23 books. And I want to remind you, these are books that represent these races. These are not books that are written by these races. So most of those 23 books were written by white folks. They were not written by. The authors are not necessarily reflected. Okay. The authors, the predominant authorship is white folks writing about non-white people. But let's look and see what happened to the animals, right? They went from 12% to 27%. So publishers decided they were just going to skirt the entire issue and just say, okay, well, we're not publishing as much about white folks. We're going to put everybody over there in the animals, right? Now, I know today we're talking about YA, and there are much fewer anthropomorphized animals in this. But I think we need to keep an eye on this. I think we need to keep an eye on how publishing reacts and supplies the marketplace. All right. In YA, you have a different set of problems. You have a different set of representation issues. But really, the percentage of races represented is, so you have to take out the anthropomorphized animals, is very similar. I mean, something like 70, 80, about 70% of the protagonists, now I'm not talking about all characters, of protagonists are white in YA novels, right? That's not great. Now, you might ask, why is that? Dr. Jiménez. I don't know, I'm just going to voice for you. If you look at the industry, you look at publishing industry. Now, this is not just children's literature. This is a study I did, paid for by Lee and Low Books. Great publisher, by the way, and they didn't pay me to say that. But they collected all the data. They hired a company to collect all the data, and then I did the analysis on it. Here's what the publishing industry looks like, right? So look at this, right? Most of the people that work in publishing, just overall, most of them are white, cis women, overwhelmingly straight and non-disabled, right? So remember what I said, that we have a tendency to have bias toward those of us who we think of as us, right? Look at this, right? That's why I say we have to look at systems. We can't just look at one book or that book or this award or that award. We need to look at how things are being run. Right? Because our society runs on an assumed normative standard. Okay, and the US runs on this assumed normative standard. That's white, straight, cis. Cis means same. So it means you perform the gender that you were assigned at birth. Okay, so I was assigned female at birth, and I present and perform as a female, right, in my life. So white, straight, cis, male, Christian, able, and middle class, right? That's what systems are set up to support and promote in our country. And when I say systems, I don't just mean publishing. I mean education, medicine, law, every system you can think about. This is the standard to which everything else is measured. Kimberly Crenshaw, she is a lawyer, brilliant lawyer, and she posited the idea of intersectionality. And the idea of intersectionality is very, very important when we start talking about the representation of people. What intersectionality says is that we have these systems, they're in place to promote and support this very, 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 very specific group of people, right? And then anything that falls outside of that assumed norm, right, is less and less supported. And the farther you go outside that assumed norm, the less a system can support you. Like it's literally not designed to. So it's not going to, because it breaks down. The system literally breaks down. All right. And the most important thing that she says is that marginalized identities are additive. Right. So if you're not white, so let's say you're Black, right? That's one issue, right? But if you're a Black woman, that's farther away from that assumed norm, right? If you're a Black lesbian or a Black trans woman, right? Or a Black trans woman who uses a wheelchair, if you just keep going, the farther and farther and farther you get away from this very tightly controlled assumed norm, the less anything is built for you, the less anything is there for you. All right. And this becomes really important when we start looking at books that represent people that fall outside this norm. All right. At this point, I always want to remind people, I'm not saying that white people are the problem. I'm saying that whiteness is the problem. I'm not saying that straight people are the problem. I'm saying that heteronormativity is the problem, right? It's not the individual. It's the system and the way we support the system. Okay. All right. All right. I'm going to check in on this chat for a second and see if we should answer any questions right now. So let's stop sharing. Okay. All right.
Charlotte asks, what set of books were surveyed?
Right. So Charlotte, every year the CCBC does this study, it's picture books that are published in America. And so it's all picture books published in America. There are some other folks that do other research. So like Melinda Lowe, she's a YA author. She does some research. I do some research in YA representation. But what we found is it's strikingly similar. So although it's not the same exactly when you're looking at picture books, it's strikingly similar, right? And I think that's important to keep in mind. I think at this point also is I mentioned that it doesn't track. There's no one-to-one correlation between who's represented and who's the author. But 4 years ago, 2018, what is that? Is that 5 years ago? No, that's 3 years ago. Okay, I don't remember time anywhere. I don't remember how time works, right? But in 2018, they did another different group, looked at authors, like the race of authors who are published in America, and it was 7%. 7% of the authors published in America are not white.
And Laura, I wonder, is there a similar survey about sexual orientation and gender identity, or is that information just not available?
Well, we actually, it's funny you say that. A group of us have started to look at. I did a study where I looked at the awards, right? So I looked at so there's some big awards. There's the Stonewall and the Lambda are the big awards. And so I looked at what had been awarded in the last 20 years, what the protagonist identity that had been awarded. And the funny thing is, and of course, when academics say things like funny and interesting, it's never funny and it's always problematic, right? So the majority of the protagonists in these YA books that had won awards for being LGBTQIA books. Okay, so the award was specifically for LGBTQIA YA novels. More than half of the protagonists were straight. Right? There were no bi characters, none, zero, zip. Something like 80% were white, right? Again, it's the same, we're being fed and we're consuming the same stories over and over and over again. So in some ways, it's really, really difficult for folks that belong to those dominant paradigms, that their identities align with that normative standard. It's actually very difficult for them to read outside their experiences, because A, the books aren't really there, right? There's not a lot of books. And then B, they haven't really been trained how to do it, right? So I think that's an incredibly important thing that Vermont Humanities has been trying to do, trying to bring books that people would not normally, right? Don't normally is such an awkward word, but books that don't necessarily reflect your state, right? That the identities in these books do not necessarily reflect the majority of the state. And it's been so important for me to work with you, because I think that's what we need to start doing. We need to start showing white folks what it means to be not white, right? And the best we can do that, right, is what Dr. Sims Bishop calls, right, window books, right? Sometimes her research came up with the idea of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, right? And people are always like really cool about the windows, right? They're great about like mirrors. Yes, it reflects you, right? People are like, got it, easy, right? And then windows, you're like, good. I look out a window and I see outside. Okay, got it. The hard one is sliding glass doors, right? And sliding glass doors means they're books that invite you into another experience, right? And those are books that are rich narratives that are written in ways that have an authentic representation, that have a rich, dynamic literary quality. And it also takes a reader that's willing to take the risk to be swallowed up by that narrative, right? To believe that a narrative exists outside their own lived experiences, right?
We certainly would hope that We Contain Multitudes is all three of those things, right? That
I
it
think
is, that it is a mirror, a window, and a sliding glass door.
exactly, which is why I love this book, right? I think it's so important. Now, importantly, it's not considered own voices, right? Because, right, Sarah Henstra is not a gay man. She's not, right? And so when I talk about these things, right, these qualifiers or these ways of looking at literature, I'm not saying that because a book is an own voices book means it's a fabulous book automatically. Or if it isn't an own voices book, it's crud automatically, right? I'm not saying that. I'm saying this is something we have to look for, right? We have to deal with. And very much folks that are writing outside their identities, they have to do a lot more work, right? And they have to do that work in ways that folks like Christopher see themselves reflected, right? I'm not going to see myself reflected in this, even though this is, part of the LGBTQIA community, right? I'm a lesbian, right? I don't know what it was like to be a teenage boy in high school dealing with bullying. Now I know what it was like to be a teenage girl, right? A teenage lesbian in high school dealing with bullying. And it is not all that different. I mean, I got to say, the bullying that goes on in here is so awful and on point. I thought that was amazing. But it's that when we have a book that's not written by the community, we need to read it with extra care. And we need to listen to folks in that community and see what they're saying about it. Now, this book has not gotten rave reviews from absolutely everybody. It wouldn't. Nothing will, right? But this book is a solid representation of what it means for two people from vastly different backgrounds to try to come together and figure out each other's lives, which is, I think, why it's such a fabulous window, mirror, and sliding glass door, right? Opportunity for readers, right? Because it has these different experiences going on. Okay, I'm going to keep, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think Sarah, although she might not use the term sliding glass door, is writing from that perspective.
Yes.
Because she has told us that she was inspired to write the book from observing her teenage children and their friends and how they interact with each other.
Right. So in some ways, I look at this book and I think, what a fabulous piece of anthropology, right? She got into their lives and she was adjacent. She was closely adjacent, which is incredibly important, right? She wasn't just, writing at her kitchen table and had no interaction with teens or, and she didn't hear them talk or watch what they were going through. I mean, I really think she's done a great job with this. I really do. I will say I'm endlessly impressed with this book, and not just because it's and not gay man writing this, but it's just a good piece of literature.
Keep throwing questions into the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll come back around to answer more questions in a bit. I'm gonna come off my video.
Perfect. Okay, so one of the things that we want to focus on, one of the things we want to make sure that we're doing, hold on, I'm going to close this, is we want to make sure that we're asking questions. So we're going to assume that folks are going to get into this. They're going to read it. Sometimes you want to chunk it up. So you read like 5 chapters at a time, right? Chapters are pretty, they fly by pretty well. One thing that I think is really interesting, hold on, I'm going to go out of order here. One thing that I find incredibly interesting about this book is that it's an epistolary novel, all right, which happens to be one of my favorite forms of personal narrative. I think it is an undervalued. I also think it's technically incredibly difficult to do well. So I gave you some of my favorite epistolary novels. Right, so The Color Purple, it's all letters, right, between the sister, or from one sister to another, right? Speak by Laurie Halls Anderson, right? Those are diary entries. Perks of Being a Wallflower, right? World War Z are, that's Max Brooks's zombie apocalypse book. I don't know if anybody read it, but it's a set of reports from somebody out in the field as the world is being taken over by zombies. Codename Verity, another fabulous book, dual, like this one. It's 2 points of view, right? And they're writing letters to each other. That's 2 girls in World War II. Dear Rachel Maddow, I think it's a great book. It's an epistolary novel written in email form. So this girl, very much like We Contain Multitudes, has this assignment to write letters, or to write a letter to a hero, and she chooses Rachel Maddow, and she talks about breaking up with her girlfriend and maybe finding a new girlfriend, and her, and her friend group and all this. And you see this girl's whole life in the ways that she talks to or writes emails to Rachel Maddow. A Gabby Girl in Pieces, another fabulous diary. And then Everything, right? The epistolary novel is very, very old. If y'all, there's some serious, book nerds in here. If you remember, Frankenstein was an epistolary novel. They've been around bazillions of years. I'm sure it's not bazillion, but it's one of the oldest forms of novels, because if you go back a couple hundred years, the Catholic Church banned fiction. All right. So if you go back to like Chaucer, right? Chaucer, was a form of an epistolary novel, because it was somebody's, it was all stories told at the campfire, right? Epistolary novels are supposed to give you a feeling of being part of the life of the authors, of the writers. Like you're getting an intimate view into their private lives. The reason why epistolary novels were really important during the time is, again, the idea of fiction was you were lying, right? And so you couldn't lie. That's, the church didn't want you lying about things. So instead, authors would use this conceit, this epistolary novel conceit, and that way they could write whatever they wanted, but they could say, oh, no, I heard it in a pub, or I found this book, or I found this diary, or I found these letters, right? And so it was this conceit, but it's this beautiful way of like literally getting into people's heads, right? And so I think it's important to introduce the idea of epistolary novels when you get into this, because it's a little bit different. They're not very popular anymore. You don't see a lot of them. You see very, very few. I think, again, it's technically incredibly difficult to pull this off. So I did want to talk a bit about discussion questions, because, hopefully y'all will get these. You'll have book groups, right? You'll have folks meeting like this over Zoom. And you'll, sometimes it helps to feed questions to folks to start the conversations. And there's a couple of different kinds of discussion questions. The first level, we call them reading checks. Sometimes people call them comprehension checks. They're very basic, right? They're very like you could find the evidence directly on a page. You could say, well, on page 7, right, little Joe says, this is why I got this name, right? On page 14, Carl starts talking about football, right? So you can find that. It's not really much anything else. It's just it's sort of a way to check to see that they've read the pages. Okay, so those are reading checks, and they're important, especially in education, right? We want to make sure that the kids are actually reading. And I don't like the idea of making that a punitive kind of assessment. It's just checking in. People read it? Yes? No? Maybe? Right? Then you might have an understanding check, right? So those are a little more, right? That's a little more interactive, a little more interesting, right? So like, Why, what is important about the little Joe's name? Why, right? Does he like it? Why does he use it, right? He uses throughout the text. If you haven't read it, I'm not going to give you spoilers, but throughout the text, little Joe talks a lot about being confined or caged. And I think, one thing you might do is you might ask them, why is that a reappearing motif? Why is that a reappearing metaphor in this book, right? And, folks might come up with a reason, 2 reasons, they have an opinion, right? You're just sort of like seeing, like, if they're seeing something that they might think that is important, that they picked up on, right? And then lastly, and these are the granddaddies. These are the ones that are hard to get to. They're really, really important. And this is where you get people to start interpretation, right? And literary analysis and literary activity is really about the interpretation of the text. All right. Now, I'm checking the time. I am of the, great. I'm of the opinion, I'm of the school of thought where the author brings all of themselves, all of their language and experience and history. They bring everything to the text. And then once it's written, the author is dead to the text. In other words, I'm not going to ask the author a question. I'm going to ask the text the question. And I'm going to rely on the reader to help me with the interpretation, right? So what does it mean? Why are these 2 characters so important, right? Why is it important for these 2 characters to be in conversation with each other? One is a big burly football player and the other is out and effeminate young man, right? All right. So these are some, I'm actually teaching this semester. I decided I would go ahead and give this a shot. So I'm teaching it in my own children's literature course. And these are some of the questions I'm going to ask folks, right? So what makes epistolary novels work, right? What is it about them that makes them work, right? And what about this book works, right? Or what doesn't? Like, what did you hate about it? If you couldn't finish it, why, right? If you can't wait for the second book to come out, there is rumors that she's going to write a second one, right? Why? Where are you the most affected? Where did you connect the most? Where did you disconnect, right? You want to find those aesthetic moments in these books, right? You want to find where people have those, I'm going to keep doing this with my hands, right? Where they have those moments of physical, emotional reaction to what's happening, right? What challenged you about this book? Some of the critics that I've read say they really do not, I love this as a criticism, that the book is too well written to represent teen boys. Wow. I mean, what kind of random, like, side eye kind of slight is that on teen boys? I mean, like, they can't have rich emotional lives and they can't find a way to express it. I mean, I think that's that's just a very sort of like plays into the toxic masculinity nonsense we have going on in this country right now. I really love the language, and I actually do find it very possible. I have 2 sons. Most of their friends are guys. I've done very much like Sarah Henstra did. I, drove around in cars with them. I listened to I totally eavesdropped when they were hanging out in the living room and, eating a pizza per person, right? I could totally see this kind of stuff happening, right? And then this one, I love this one, especially for YA novels. Okay. If you were going to cast this as a movie, what actors would you use and why? That will get teenagers, especially, they will start firing immediately. It gets them into visualizing, right? You can ask them about, like, what pieces of dialogue does that make you think of? Why that person, why that voice, right? All of that. You can really get into some interesting conversations when you start talking about casting it as a movie, that was me doing a lot of just like verbal dump on you about this book. And I will just say again, I really, really, really loved it. It's not the perfect book, right? And let's keep in mind, there is no perfect book, right? But the more variety we have with representation, the better off we are. Oh, another lover, World War Z, so good, so weird, right? Okay, and then let's see, Nicole, there's an intimacy in epistolary novels, right? Because the stories shared go through that filter of emotion and thought. Yeah, those are good. Liz, there are bad epistolary novels that just read very, like, you can't tell one character from the other. I'm not going to mention them. I'm going to throw people under the bus. But yeah, I think it is. It's that immediacy. It's okay. Hang on. So there's this one. So what's interesting about this is a lot of epistolary novels are written so that they are physically separated, right? So that the characters they don't actually interact in real life. And this one is not like that. This one, these two guys go to the same school and they have this very rich letter writing, right, relationship, but they don't really register each other in real life. Okay, but by the middle of the book, they're starting to talk about what they're seeing each other do, right? So it's almost like this added layer, right? So in the middle of the book, little Joe writes, I looked up from my desk in English just now and saw you at the window and caught your smile. You were gone before I had time to smile back or to feel a heat on my face. I'd already spotted you when the bell rang over to the flagpole, locking up Nellie with one of your gloves hanging on your teeth. Later, I saw you again in the hall, digging through your backpack and pulling out a pencil, which fell on the floor while you were doing up the zipper. I saw you in the computer lab talking to Mr. Carlson. I saw you through the gym doorway, leaning against the wall, staring into space. Oh, and I came by Kang's room right after lunch and read your letter. Right? So they start to witness each other's lives and tell each other what they're witnessing. I mean, again, it's these little moments, it's these, oh, it's so good, so good. I'm going to stop talking now.
Laura, I think one of the really interesting moments about that particular scene for me is how realistic it is to the experience of many high school kids where they are functionally operating in different universes,
yes,
even though they can see each other, right? That it would have been absolutely unsafe at that point in the book for either of them to have acknowledged the other person. Yeah. Yes. And it takes a long time for them to get over that level of fear.
I should have marked it, but I would say it's the last quarter of the book. I mean, it takes a long time. And they're both dealing with it, which is what I really like. You know, it's not all one saying, oh, me, and the other one saying, no, it's really both of them.
There's a question from Nicole in the chat. I'm proposing this text to my department, but I'm getting pushback that it is a romance. I'm pulling in the epistle aspect and the Walt Whitman connection. Do you have any suggestions against the romance argument?
It's not a romance, it's a bromance.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, look at the Iliad. The Iliad is the first bromance that I ever read, right? Homer was all about the bromance. This is not a romance, but it's not it's not a sexual romance between these two guys. It is a book that shows, I mean, to me, Christopher, really push back on me if I've got this wrong. Again, I'm not a guy, not a cis guy, right? To me, this shows the opportunity for men to explore emotion and intimacy without sex, right? Intimacy in a very safe way, right? Now, yes, there is romance to it, right? But it's not about that. That's not the central thing that's happening. What do you think?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think it's primarily about friendship. There is a romantic element to the relationship later on,
Right, but it gets
but it's much later on, and I don't know that. It would be very interesting to see a sequel and see what happens to them when they go off to Duluth, and do they stay a couple, or do they become more of a bromance? Is it more
right,
of a friendship
right.
for the two of them?
Also, Nicole, I would say this. I would say I think the best way to bring something like this into the classroom,
Mhm.
right, is that we know that still the self-harm and suicide rate, drug addiction, and alcohol addiction of LGBTQIA teens is skyrocketing, and it is only increasing.
Mhm.
Okay, it is only increasing. And we also know that the things that help kids is having things like LGBTQIA plus clubs, seeing things like this book in the curriculum, knowing that they can survive, right? Having atmospheres, having a school that isn't afraid to say gay, lesbian, trans, right? This is part of survival, right? And it is not being dramatic.
Yeah, I want to get to a question from Wendy, which I think is really, really important, and it's fundamentally about the question of consent, which is a big issue in the book.
Yes.
Wendy says, Frankenstein does start with letters for the exact same reason you discussed, believability, layers to the narrative. However, the novel itself is not back and forth like this title, Frankenstein. I connected with how Curl fixed the bike, but I'm struggling right now with the initial scene in the car. Not sure how to address the sexuality in a high school classroom, and I did disconnect as a reader at that point. I think that's a really key moment in the book where the teenagers are not that skilled, right? They don't actually have what they need to negotiate that relationship. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I think it's really, and I understand it. Look, I am not saying, Wendy, that this is going to be an easy book or that this is something that you can just like go in cold, right? But we know that, right, that social emotional learning looks different in high school. And we know that consent and not just saying no, right, or not, you know, or not talking about consent doesn't work. Right. So in some ways, what I am seeing in this book is an issue of non-consensual physical interaction. It is not to be taken lightly. It is not like, oh, that's just fine. Right. And I think it's a really rich place to talk openly with students about it. Right. I mean, I really think that the great thing about YA as a general form, as a general, you know, it's not a genre, as a form, is that it allows kids to explore dangerous territory in the safety of the pages, right? It's not written in a way that says, this is how you should do this. It's written in a really, really, it's hard. It's hard to read. It's hard to experience. It's hard to get over. But very much like Laurie Halsey Anderson's Speak, I think it needs to be, I don't like the word confronted, but it really does need to be confronted, right? And talked about directly in school. We need to make this part of our general education, right? Consent should not be just one day on in health class, right? And to me, this book really gives you an idea of what shouldn't you do it, right? What shouldn't you be doing? What's problematic about what's happening, right? And it's going to feel really familiar to a lot of kids.
I would say, yeah, this is also a good place for me to plug the webinar number 2 on the 18th, where our good friend Lizzie Lyons at the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence will be part of the panel talking about this very issue. And they have been amazing, along with the folks at Outright, also will be around on the 18th, and providing us at Vermont Humanities with training and resources around relationships and consent and how to talk about them with teenagers. so of course, as you read this book, one of the first things that I notice as an adult is that Joe and Curl as characters do not have the skills that they need to negotiate the feelings that they're having. And they sort of get there by the end of the book, but they're still teenagers functionally, and it's still going to take them a while to evolve and understand what we think of as consent.
Exactly. And I think it's so important what you're saying. They are teenagers. Look, y'all, go back to when you were dating people at 15 or 16. What the hell were we doing? Right? We were terrible to each other. And I'm not even talking about sexual assault. I'm just saying in general, right? That is part of what growing up is. And to see this as something that is worth study, right? That is seeable in school, worth talking about in school, is a viable thing to talk about and to experience, and to experience on the page, and to really get into it. Don't do the debate thing. Don't do that. That's the one thing. Don't do the fake debate, where like, should he, shouldn't he? No, talk about what is wrong. Talk about the awkwardness. Talk about what they should have done. Talk about corrective action, right, in those cases.
And reduction and healing.
Yeah, exactly.
Ryan posted for Lizzie in the chat that from the Vermont Network, since so much of this book is about love and relationships, how do you recommend making the conversations about this, especially opening up conversations about sexuality and sexual orientation with groups of people who may not be entirely comfortable with this topic? There are plenty of examples of heterosexual books that have similar issues with consent, for sure. So not to deflect in that direction, but I think that's important to note.
I think actually Matt de la Pena was doing a book tour with, I think it was Last Stop on Marketplace, right? Which is about, a Black kid in LA, a Black kid and his grandma in San Francisco riding a bus, right? And he was doing a book, he's doing a visit at a library, and this teacher said, or this librarian said to him, "Hey, I love all your books, but we don't have those kind of, we don't have folks here that are the same and like you, and so I don't really carry them." And without missing a beat, Matt de la Pena said, "Do you have a lot of wizards here?" Right? The fact is, we have a lot of books that represent lots of different people. We, meaning the LGBTQIA community, deserve books, right, that represent us, good, bad, and otherwise, right? We need books that we can see ourselves in. We also need books that kids that are questioning can see and explore, again, in safety, right? I think really this is an issue of looking at this from a safe distance, right? Or, right, and it should be an and, not an or, and being able to experience this when this is your life, right? Again, this book does both.
I want to ask a question not about the kids, about the parents.
Yeah.
And then I want to ask a second question about music. So I have two kind of going off in different directions. The parents in this story, both Joe's and Curl's parents, are really complicated people.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the lessons that we might take away from seeing the resilience of Joe and Curl in the face of their super complicated family relationships. And then I want to come back around to the music question, but I'll throw that one out first.
So on the first read, I didn't really even see the parents. On the first read through, I usually have to read a book 2 or 3 times before I'll teach it. On the first read through, I didn't notice them very much. I sort of put them into the category of both these guys have complex lives with lots going on. I just sort of put it in the lots going on pile. It wasn't until the second time I read through it that I'm like, wow, most of the complications they're having, like a good portion of it, is their home life controlled by these adults who are not doing a good job, right? it's funny in YA literature, very often you either get you get no parents, right? Or you get terrible parents, right? Who are almost no parents, right? Or you get, every once in a while, you get perfect parents, right? So like a lot of people have been comparing this to Aristotle and Dante Discovered the Universe. Okay. And which was again, a beautifully written book, gorgeous book. Right. But my problem with that one is that the parents were way too woke. They were way on board way too quick. Right. In this one, I think it may be one of the most authentic representations of parents having their own lives. Right. And really, yeah, I think that's it. The parents are having their own real lives. And I think in that way, the author, Sarah Henstra, does, I think that's some of what shines in this, is because you see these, through these letters between these two young men, you see their all of their lives, their siblings, their parents, right, their friends at school. And I appreciated it. I mean, I really did. I appreciated the fact that they weren't all good and they weren't all bad. Right. And you didn't
maybe Curl's stepdad was kind of all bad.
Well, okay, yeah.
But,
yes. Right.
But yes, right. They're complicated people. And
Yeah.
and of course, Curl had this amazing brother who was maybe completely unlike what you might have thought he would be.
Exactly. And I think that's, in some ways, I think his brother is the one who's going to save him.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, and Curl himself. I mean, Curl's doing a fabulous job of really navigating some hard time. Right. And and listen to me. I'm like, Curl is doing a good job, right? This book is written in such a way that these people live outside these pages for me.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I think when you can see those side characters as being complicated, that's kind of amazing. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, it's one of the reasons why this book is a chunk. I mean, this is a big book. Right. It's not for the faint of heart, but I think it's incredibly important that the author is able to fill out their world like that. Okay. And then you had a question about the music.
I had a question about music. So I'll start with just a statement about Whitman. So I think it's really interesting that you brought up the criticism earlier that some people think teenage boys could not possibly write like this.
Right.
And I absolutely agree with you that I think that is a kind of a crazy cop-out to think that teenage boys don't have complicated lives and complicated emotions. I think they absolutely do. They're just not encouraged in this culture to share them ever. Exactly. And so, related to that, people have said, I don't know any teenage boys that are interested in Walt Whitman, so that's totally fake. I'm going to leave that for a moment.
You're just going to put
you can
that
address that if you want to.
Right.
And I just want to note that when you were with us talking about The Hate U Give over the last year and a half, you talked a lot about the musicality of Angie Thomas's book and how important music was to the book. And I would argue that this book also has that.
I want to see a playlist.
Both in the musicality of Walt Whitman, but just as important, the musicality of Prince and the bluegrass music that the dad loves so much. Right. And I wonder if you can talk about that at all.
It's really interesting. I think one of the things that I like, it takes me a while sometimes to get into a book. And I'm not a big Whitman fan, right? He's way too into the male form for my liking. Not surprising considering I'm a lesbian, right? So, big surprise. And Walt Whitman is really about the male form and experiencing all things, right? And really celebrating the male form, which is great. Happy for him. Let him go and do that. Just not my cup, right? On the other hand, I think a lot of adults would be incredibly surprised by what teenagers read and what kinds of things teenagers explore, and the kinds of literature and poetry and music that teenagers dabble in, right? I mean, I think we see a slice of teen life, right? And then we think that's reality. But it's like anybody else. If somebody looked in on my life for 10 minutes one day, could they say what my entire existence is? No, right? And I love the interplay of Prince and all the bluegrass, because Prince was, I mean, he was technically amazing. He was an amazing technician, musical technician. He produced a lot of records, right? And the interplay between the music. I looked before we did this. I was hoping somebody has made a playlist. I don't think they've done it yet because it hasn't been out long enough. But I really want like some Spotify, some Pandora playlist where as you're reading this, it would just kind of have that in the background for you, right? Because I think it is important. And again, it's another way, you know, we're using the word intimacy, and I want to make sure that folks understand we're talking about an emotional intimacy that these boys are sharing, right? That these young men are sharing. And I think part of the way they get to that is through sharing music, right? And I think that's been part of the human condition. We share our loves, we share what makes us, we share what moves us, and music is very important to a lot of people's lives, right? And they, I don't know about you, Christopher. I don't know how old you are, but I am of the generation that we made mixtapes. Okay. And you made a mixtape, and you either got albums, right? Or you waited on the radio and you put it together, and you wrote up a little title thing, and like you tried to make it so it wasn't clunky, right? And then the next generation, they made CDs and it sounded so much better, right? But this idea of collecting and sharing part of yourself, literally part of yourself, with another person is another way of being vulnerable, right? And to me, that's what this music does in here. It shows how these two young men can be vulnerable.
And Shayna as well, I think, right? Joe's older sister, who's trying so desperately to figure out her connection to her mom, almost entirely through music.
Yeah. But again, it's weird because, right, we see that through these letters, right? And so the fact that, and again, I just keep going back to the craft of this book. Again, we've got Shayna's life, we've got the stepdad's life, we've got the mom's life, we've got all these lives, and we're looking at through the interpretation of these letters.
Yeah, this would be a place for me to put in another plug. We put so many resources up on the website for Vermont Reads that it might be, we didn't make a playlist, but that's a great idea. We should. But one that might easily get lost that I keep telling everybody is that there is in fact a Prince tribute band in Vermont. And we have been in touch with them, and they would love to come and do some shows. If anybody's doing a Vermont Reads project and they'd like to end with a party, the Prince tribute band Purple is available. The connection to them is available on our website. We'll invite you to the party, right?
Oh my God. Sorry.
And it's
I'm gonna have to mute myself. I'm so excited.
It's coordinated by a guy named Craig Mitchell, who some of you on the webinar might know. He's a DJ out of Burlington. But he was one of the original youth at Outright Vermont when it started in 1989. He was a teenager and was going through much the same experience as a young Black gay man growing up in Burlington that Curl and Joe were going through. And he'll tell you that having the opportunity to go to Outright when he was that teenager saved his life. So please do check that out. I see Ryan's just put a link to them. They're playing at Higher Ground. Maybe it's an 18+ show, but you can get them for your teenagers as well. And they'll give you a good deal for Vermont Reads.
I love that idea. I really, really do. Yeah.
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 We have about 10 minutes left, so please do put more questions in the chat if you want to. And I'll just also, I guess, tell people now that you do have the opportunity to invite any one of our 4 partner organizations to your community as part of Vermont Reads. They'll be presenting at the next webinar on the 18th. So it's Outright Vermont, Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and Recovery Vermont, which focuses on issues of recovery from abuse and addiction. We will pay for the honoraria to invite one of these groups into your community to present on the themes of the book and on their own work, if you would like to invite them. So there'll be more information on that in your packets that you get with the Vermont Reads books on how to access that. But a lot of the issues that Laura and I have discussed this afternoon, we can dig deeper, we can go deeper, we can go local on those by inviting those organizations to come into your community, either on Zoom or live in person all the way through next June. What else should we be thinking about before we dive into this book with our students or with our community? And remembering that it's not all going to be teenagers that are reading this book. There are plenty of senior centers and church groups and library groups that are also going to be looking at this book.
I think the way in for books, right, that feature LGBTQIA characters and stories is it's something Harvey Milk practiced. He was, the official mayor of Castro back in the 70s. And he said that it was really that the most important thing we could do, we meaning, LGBTQIA community, is to come out every day, come out whenever we are safe to do it. We have to come out because it's harder for people, right, to deny our existence if they see us. They see us every single day. So in some ways, to me, this book is a way for folks to have that coming out of their friends and neighbors experience, right? It's incredibly important for folks to understand that we exist in all strata of life, in every corner of the universe, right? Somebody is LGBTQIA+, right? We are all over the place. And this provides a space for folks to be able to ask those questions, right? To see what they may not know by not having the opportunity to talk to folks in our community. It also provides a space this book provides a really safe space to have complicated feelings about our community and about people, young people. I want us to look, the acceptance of our community in America is fabulous. It's so much more than when I was a kid or when Christopher was a kid, right? It's so much better. But the reactionary fear of us, the reactionary rejection of us is still real. And it's still damaging. So for me, this is a way for straight folks to have a conversation, because literally you're in these kids' heads, right? To have a conversation, right? That they might not be able to get any other way. And they should take that option.
And I would add to that simply this, that I think it's easy for us as adults in Vermont to think that we've got this one, that we've solved this problem. And I think if you ask any queer identified teenager in the state of Vermont how they're doing, they will tell you that they're not okay. And that they still need us as adults to stand up for them every single day. And this is one way that you can do that. Is by participating in a Vermont Reads project around We Contain Multitudes. The Youth Risk Behavior Survey shows that these issues are just as much an issue now as they were 30 years ago.
right? And I want to say, you will get pushback, right? From the very beginning, I told the humanities folks, anytime you do this work, you're going to get pushback. Okay. And the best way to do this is to say, listen, we are dealing with a community of kids that are literally dying, right? This is an issue of immediate need, right? This is not whether or not you're comfortable. This is whether or not we have space to live in this world.
Absolutely. Danielle asks if we'll be sharing the slide deck.
Yeah, I'll give it to Ryan.
Okay.
Yeah.
We will be. And Nicole, thank you for that last comment. If you have any sense of awareness and work in a high school, you know we don't have this. We're not there yet. And I will say that, you know, in closing, I think one of the things that excites a number of the queer youth that we've talked to and their advocates around the state is that We Contain Multitudes is a way to have these conversations in schools without having to go through the health class or the guidance counselors. That it normalizes queer youth experiences to be having these conversations in English class in a way that hasn't happened very often or very effectively in other contexts. And so I hope that that's really valuable. I hope that for those of you who are working in public libraries, in universities, and community centers, that you'll also take this as an opportunity to provide mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors to all the people in your community that need it. We know that not every school is going to be ready for We Contain Multitudes, but there can be one place in every community that's ready to have that conversation, and kids will notice that you're standing up for them.
Yeah.
So I think we'll leave it there.
Yeah.
And say thank you, Dr. Jiménez. You'll be back on the 18th and participating in the Q&A with the panelists from Outright Vermont, Recovery Vermont, Howard Center, and Vermont Network. Sign up on our website for that. Ryan put the link in the chat. You can also apply to host a Vermont Reads project if you haven't done that yet. Think carefully about it. Call us up if you have questions. We're happy to help. Thank you to Ryan and to Rochelle, Johnny, Linda, everybody at the Vermont Humanities team who helped make this possible. And we hope to see you again in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, y'all, for making time.
Thanks so much.